apologize for the. I want to apologize for the panim chadashos. It's not that I'm changing my style of life or my dress or whatever, but I had cataract surgery this past week, and because of that, I think for about a week's time I have to wear these sunglasses. So again, I apologize. Now this week's Sedra is Parshas Vayeira. And the question is asked already by the Midrashim, what is the connection between Parshas Vayeira and the end of Pasuk Lech Lecha, the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, that discusses the mitzvah Bris Milah. And some say that, and Rashi implies this, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to be Mevaker Chola, to visit Abraham while he was sick. After all, he was at the age of 99, and he went through Bris Milah, and there was a duration of 3 days of pain, 3 days of sickness. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu went to be Mevaker Cholehem. And this has halachic significance also, because the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, of visiting the sick, is part of the mitzvah of Halachta B'drachav, following the path of God, following his example. And in regard to many traits, we find that. For example, when Adam HaRishon discovered his nakedness, so the Torah tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made for him big deyor, leather clothes. When Avram died, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Menachem Aval Yitzchak. When Avram was sick, so the HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes and is Mevaker Cholehem. So the connection is to tell us about the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, which is part of a more general mitzvah of a halachta b'drachav, following in his path. Now, but I think that there might be a simpler pshat in accordance with the simple reading of the Torah. Now, the Torah tells us that when after the Malachim, the three angels, disguised as Arabs, travelers in the desert, visited Avram, and Avram invites them in and gives them food and accompanies them on their way. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Hamechasani me Avram," because God was suggesting that he should and that he would destroy the city of Sdom, because the people in the city of Sdom were chatoim v'roim la'Hashem. They acted in a very sinful manner. And it wasn't just against God that they were acting in a sinful manner, although that's clear from the pasuk. But they acted in a terrible manner in the Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, in the realm of relations with people. It's brought down that visitors would come. The visitors would be tortured and killed. So God told Avram that he hears the cries emanating from the city of Sodom because of the wickedness and the corruption that is done there. And God says, I have to determine, of course, this all has to be understood when we talk about God, but I have to determine whether I should destroy the city or not. And then Avram pleads on behalf of the people of Sodom. And the question is, why is it that and God said, but before God told Avram, God said, "Hamachasani me Avram." Am I going to hide from Avram what I'm going to do, what I possibly might do to the city of Sodom? And because Abraham Tiyadatim, he says, Abraham is going to be a great nation. And Lamana Shiyitzava, and I love Abraham. Tiyadatim. And why do I love him? Lamana Shiyitzava as Banav as Beisu Achrab v'Shamru Derech Hashem. Because he will command his children after him, and they will observe the ways of God. So the question is, what is going on here? Why is it necessary for Avram to know of God considering destroying the city of Sodom? And also, why did God formulate it in this form of, I might have to destroy the city of Sodom? I'm going to go down and look. Certainly God was aware. And what is the connection between Avram being a great nation, between Avram being beloved by God, and the fact that God feels he is compelled, there is necessity, I should say, to inform Avram of his possible intentions. Now, I've mentioned very often the question of the Ramban just recently. Well, again, the question of the Ramban regarding the Akedah. Regarding the Akedah, the Ramban asks, why is it that God had to command Avram, to test Avram? God certainly knew that Avram would comply with his command. So why was it necessary? So the Ramban says, to take it out from the state of the potential into the state of the actual. Now, so I mentioned, what does that mean? That to take it from the state of the potential to the state of the actual. I've mentioned many times my father's pshat, that God knew, but it was important for Avram to know his potential. Sometimes we don't know our own potential, and because we don't know our own potential, we do not perform in the manner that we could. But I suggested, I'm not saying that this is what the Ramban meant, but it certainly goes along those lines of going from the state of the potential into the state of the actual, that there are many areas of life where lectures and shiurim and speeches and kokores and books and svarim could not be successful in teaching the Derech Hashem, in teaching God's approach. And this is particularly true when it comes to character traits. My father, I was once talking with my father about one of the great mashgichim, the spiritual advisors in the yeshivas in Europe. My father said to me, he says, everybody thinks that he had his impact on his students because, if I can use the Yiddish word, the shmuzin, the speeches, the lectures that he gave to the students. My father says it came out in the lectures, but the reason he had that impact, that influence, and it was a great influence, was because of the personal relationship that he had with students. And when it comes to character traits, which is the focus of Musar, so when it comes to character traits, the most important thing is the example set. Is the example set. And when the Torah, the Torah said that the Torah was not written, for Chumash Bereishis was not written as a biography of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The purpose of Chumash Bereishis is for Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to be living examples in regard to certain character traits. Moshe Rabbeinu certainly taught by example, but Moshe Rabbeinu is identified as the teacher of halacha, of the legal requirements, whether it's ritualistic legal requirements or legal requirements that have to do bein adam lechaveiro, or it has to do with the forms of service, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher Moshe. The Avos are a teacher when it comes to character traits. And that's what the Torah was telling us about why HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to tell Avram that he's considering destroying stone. Why? It was in order for Avram to appeal to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not to destroy stone, even though ultimately stone was destroyed. But future generations could not learn from Avram Avinu's potential. They could only learn from the traits that were demonstrated and actualized. And that's the idea also of the Akedah. The idea when God gave the command to Avram Avinu to put his son Yitzchak on the Mizbeach, on the altar, and tie him there and give him as a sacrifice to God, or to raise him on the altar. So it was not that God didn't know chas v'shalom that Avram would comply, but it was in order to teach future generations the idea of subservience to God, to teach future generations the importance of karbanos, that they shouldn't think chas v'shalom that the main aspect of a carbon is giving an animal to God. But the animal, in a sense, is symbolic of giving ourselves over to God. We are in place. The animal is in place of us. So the idea was to serve as an example, and all the avos are mentioned in the Torah to serve as an example for future generations. The fact that the Emos are not mentioned as much is because the traits of the Emos that were given over in a nurturing process were probably more successfully transmitted than the traits of the Avos, of the patriarchs. And consequently, there wasn't the same need to keep that example alive. Now, the traits, what are the traits that are associated with Klal Yisrael, with the Jewish people? Sages tell us that the traits to be identified as the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the character traits are Rachmanim, Baishanim, and Gomli Chasadim. To be merciful, to be modest, and to do kindness. These are the signs, the character signs of a Jew. We could perhaps suggest that the Torah wants us to know that Gerus, let's say the Bris Milah, what was the Gerus of Avram? Now there is a discussion as to whether Avram was a ger or Avram was not the ger. Whether Avram, because the word, the Das Kenim Ibalatosvis in next week's Sedra, maybe I'll discuss it next week. He says that Avram was a ger. And if Avram was a ger, when was that gerus completed? The gerus was completed with the Bris Milah. And if Avram, the Bris Karav, however, felt that Avram was not a ger, he was the first Jew. He says because a ger comes from the word, well, he didn't say that. He says a ger is an immigrant. He is somebody that joins a people from somewhere else. Avram didn't join the people, didn't join the Jewish people. He was the foundation of the Jewish people. But he was the first Jew. So, and when was he recognized as the first Jew? When after he underwent the Bris Milah. So, in other words, we have to understand that being a Jew should not just be viewed as something based on a physical symbol, a ritualistic act, and complying with all kinds of rituals. But being a Jew demands and necessitates having certain character traits. So immediately after the gerus, after the conversion of Avram, or after Avram becoming a complete Jew, so the Torah tells us Avram and Sarah of their traits of Rachmanim, Baishanim, and Gomli Chasadim, of the mercifulness, the modesty, and Gomel Chasadim, Gemilas Chesed manifests itself in doing kindness. We see Gemilas Chasadim of Avram and Sarah when 3 travelers, they didn't know that they were Malachim. 3 people who were, in a sense, far removed from God, that worship the sand, according to our sages. And Avram treats them like they were royalty. That shows Gemilas Chasadim. That shows kindness. the Das Kenim in Balatosphus says, why was Avram standing out there in the heat of the day? He says, because that was the time for the meal. And Avram couldn't eat a meal unless he shared it with somebody else. That's what the Das Kenim in Balatosphus says. He had to do kindness. So this is what the trait of Gemilas Chesed, of doing kindness, we learn from Avram. And when do we learn it? After the Bris Milah, because that's the sign of a Jew. Baishan, modesty. Now we have this idea of modesty, that people should have their clothes covering up their body. For some reason, it's emphasized much more by women than by men. But the main idea behind modesty, and of course, to a certain degree, there is truth to the fact that modesty manifests itself in a certain type of dress, but a person can cover themselves with all kinds of costumes and be less modest than the one who doesn't cover themselves up as well. Because the modesty, my father would say, is an internal quality that has external manifestations. Sometimes the external manifestations comes from the internal qualities. And sometimes the internal qualities come from the external acts of modesty. I always say that to a certain degree, the difference between the European Jew and the American Jew is the European Jew, their commitment, their devotion, and their character traits came from the inside out. In America, perhaps because of the influence of the society, to a large degree, it's the outside. And I'm talking about the positive traits that sometimes successfully creates inner positive qualities, inner positive traits. But these are the traits of a Jew, and we should associate these traits with our Jewishness. A matter of fact, it's very interesting. Well, the Brisker Rav, and I have a lot of trouble with this thought of the Brisker Rav. But the Brisker Rav mentions in Parsha Shemos that Basya, the daughter of Paro, she went down to the Or, to the Nile River. Torah says, Lirchotz Bayor, to wash yourself in the Yor. And she saw the basket that contained baby Moshe. And feelings of mercy were in her heart. And she saved Moshe from drowning. And she hired Yocheved at the urging of Miriam to nurse him. And then Moshe became like her adopted son. Now, our sages tell us, Lirchotz Bayor, that she went down Megilgule Aviha, from the idolatry of her father. And the Medrash says that she underwent gerus at that time. She underwent conversion at that time. okay, there was no Bezdin. There are answers to that. Maybe we'll discuss it when we get to Parsha Shemos. But it was a form of gerus, of conversion. The Bris Milah brings that as a raya. There's a famous question whether there was real Dushas Yisrael, sanctity of the Jews, before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah. So, well, if there was conversion beforehand, there certainly had to be Dushas Yisrael. There certainly had to be the sanctity, Jewish sanctity beforehand. But the Bris Milah says, how did our sages see from this parsha that she underwent conversion? It says she went lirchos bayor. She went to wash herself. One could understand that without saying it was a conversion process. So Bris Milah said, because of the way she reacted when she saw the basket of Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, she had the traits, the Jewish traits. And if she hadn't converted, she wouldn't have these traits. Now, personally, I have a lot of trouble with that thought, because you don't get traits, character traits, good character traits, just by putting your head below the water. Character traits have to be developed. But what is true, and I think I once heard, not in regard to the Parsha of Basya, but I think I once heard in the name of the Chazon Ish, and it's self-evident, even if the Chazon Ish didn't say it, that before somebody goes through gerus, so we ask him all kinds of questions. Do you accept this mitzvah? Do you accept that mitzvah? We tell him the consequences of being a Jew. We tell him the hardships of being a Jew. We tell him of the possible punishments he gets if he's Jewish and he doesn't observe the mitzvahs of the Torah. So the Chazon Ish supposedly said, but it's true in any case. The reason I say it that way, because I didn't see it inside. Anybody can repeat anything in anybody's name. If the Chazon Ish didn't say it, he would have said it. So we have to make sure that he has character traits, midos, that are proper. And it goes without saying, although I did not hear that in the name of the Chazon Ish, that he has to have the Jewish character traits. And it's interesting, the expression of the Rambam in discussing the evaluation of a ger is bodkin acharav. We search after him. He doesn't say bodkin also. We search him. Search him would imply we ask him questions and he gives us satisfactory answers. I once heard from one of the outstanding Dayanim, Rabbi Arenthau, who was the head of the London Bezdin. He said that from experience, he feels, this is based on his experience in gerus, it's not enough to have meetings with the potential ger, but you have to have people who check after them, who look after them. I think he said that he instituted that potential gerim in London should stay for a certain period of time in Jewish homes, not only to see what a Jewish home is like, but also in order to be aware of what they are like, what the potential ger is like, that the Bezdin should have a source, both kinachrav. But when you search after him, of course, it's very important to make sure that he is truly committed to the mitzvahs of the Torah. But I think in both kinachrav, there is an additional element when it comes to character traits. It's very easy to say, yes, 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 yes. What are you going to say? Are you modest? And he'll say, yes. Character traits have to be observed. So it's true that she had these midos, Basha, of rachmanas, of regard for human life. Which was not prevalent in her father's home. But that's why, it's because she had these character traits that she underwent Geras. She had the character traits that is necessary for conversion. But if we had said like the Bris Milah, we could have understood very easily why these three parshios, in other words, the parsha that talks about Avram being Gomlei Chesed, Avram showing kindness with the three travelers in the desert, Sarah, Behine Ba'ohel, Sarah was in the tent. That shows Baishan, modesty. What does modesty mean? The internal quality of modesty. The internal quality of modesty is you don't have to be the center of attention. And even Avram, what does Avram do? He becomes their waiter. So he does talk with them, he mixes with them, but in a different sort of way. He was not the center of attention. Perhaps the Torah makes him the center of attention because Torah wants us to learn from him. But in the meeting that Avram had with the three malachim who appeared as travelers through the desert, they were the center of attention. And Avram was l'shorsam, to serve them. And then Rachmanim, Avram mercifulness, Avram pleads on behalf of the people of Sdom. Why Avram didn't plead on behalf of Yitzchak? Because there was a command given to him. When there's a command, it's just submission. So we have to learn from Avram's example of character traits. But according to Bris Milah, we could understand why the character traits are mentioned afterwards. But if we say, as I assume, to me it seems very simple, that you can't assume that the character traits developed just while the person either put his head in the water or raised his head in the water. And we know for sure that Avram had these character traits up till his Geras. And When Eliezer goes to search for a wife for Yitzchak, what does he check out? He checks out the character traits. So we see that the character traits should be prerequisites for becoming Jewish, and certainly for becoming an Av V'Em of Klal Yisrael. It's not something that just happens after one went through conversion. So we have to understand, why does the Torah emphasize it afterwards? Now, we have to understand also and I think, in addition to the connection being the character traits, there is another lesson between the connection between Parshas Vayeira and Parshas Lech Lecha. Now, in the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, Avram, and actually this sheds light on all of Parshas Lech Lecha. What is Parshas Lech Lecha all about? Parshas Lech Lecha is the parsha of separation. Lech Lecha me'artzecha mimawladetcha beis abicha al aretz asher arecha. Separate yourself. And then, but Lot goes with him. And ultimately, he has to separate himself from Lot. And then he has the mitzvah Bris Milah. The mitzvah Bris Milah clearly, which the circumcision is also used as the symbol of used as an act of gerus, of conversion, that represents separateness, different. So the parsha of Lech Lecha is the parsha of separation. But it's interesting, even though Avram separates himself, he separates himself from Lot. But when Lot is in trouble, he's there. And when he had the dilemma, and it took years for Avram to deal with this dilemma. The dilemma was that why did Avram allow Lot to go? Okay, there are medrashim that say he did it as a chesed. There are medrashim that imply that it was a positive act on Avram's part, taking his nephew who lost his father. And there are medrashim on the contrary that say that Avram should not have taken Lot along. But ultimately, the mitzvah Bris Milah could not be given to him. And the mitzvah Bris Milah could not have been given to him until Lot separated. But even so, it's not that Avram was not concerned about Lot. He was concerned about Lot. And when Lot is in trouble, Avram risks his life to save Lot in Parshas Lech Lecha. But Avram couldn't form one nation together with Lot. And so, and this was a sense of dilemma that Avram had, probably. In other words, if Avram did not form a separate nation, if he was part of the nations of the world, and the nations of the world were very interested in Avram's involvement, They wanted to identify with him. As the Bnei Chai said in Parshas Vayeira, Nesi Elokim atov b'sochenu. You are a prince of God in our midst. So Avram might have felt, I might have a bigger influence from the inside. But if I go through Bris Milah, if I separate myself at one time completely, then I'll have lesser of an influence. And this took, throughout the years, it took years for Avram to realize that he had to separate himself. But the separation didn't mean that he wasn't concerned about mankind. He had to be concerned about mankind also, just as Avram was concerned about Lot. And the truth is, it could be that short term, Avram might have had a bigger influence or a greater influence if he was identified with the nations in whose midst he was. And to a certain degree, he said, "Ger v'toshav anochi imachem." But long term, if he didn't say, "Ger," I'm something separate. I'm not part of your community completely. I have my own community. My destiny is a different destiny than your destiny. And I need a grave separate from your graves to symbolize that. If he didn't say that long term, his influence would have been much less. You see, look at the world around us. Monotheism. Where did the world learn monotheism? Even the biggest enemies of the Jewish people, they learned it from the Jewish people. The long-term influence of Avram Avinu. And to a certain degree, Avram had to choose, perhaps, between the present and the future. Now, it's very interesting. Rabbi Yosef Alam, he wrote one of the Yotzros for Shabbos HaGadol. So he wrote there, now there's Machlokas Rishonim, whether for Pesach you need 3 matzahs or 2 matzahs. And it's brought down that for Simcha Zelig, the Dayan of Brisk, who was very close with Reb Chaim wanted to change his minhag from 3 matzahs to 2 matzahs. And he asked Reb Simcha Zelig for his advice. The Rambam's opinion, and that's the opinion of the Vilna Gaon, is to have 2 matzahs. However, the opinion of the most of the Mefarshim and the Shulchan Aruch is that you have 3 matzahs. Many say that if you have 3 matzahs, you certainly fulfill the requirement of 2 matzahs as well. And Reb Chaim asked Reb Simcha Zelig what he felt. Do you think it's worthwhile? He probably had reason that he felt the sheet of 2 matzahs was more solid than the sheet of 3 matzahs. And he probably felt there might be a problem if you have 3 matzahs from the perspective of the opinion that you need 2 matzahs of Pesach night. So Reb Simcha Zelig, who Reb Chaim held in very high esteem, said no, because in the Yotzros, this one of the Yotzros, was composed in the early years at the time of the Gonim, even before. And he felt it was based on a certain Masorah and a tradition that was given over. They mentioned that there were 3 matzahs, Pesach by the Seder. And the 3 matzahs correspond, the Reb Yosef Elam says, it corresponds with the 3 mizbechos. the three altars that Avram built. And Reb Chaim was troubled because if you look at the Chumash, Avram really built 4 altars. There was the altar of the Akedah, he also built. And he sent his son, the Bris Milah, when he was a young boy, to mention this to Reb Simcha Zelig. And okay, but the question is there. Why is it that in the Yotzros, we say there were 3 Mizbechos, that Av Hamon Goyim, that the father of so many nations built? How are we to understand it? And I think there might be a simple answer to it. And that is the Mokom HaMizbeach, the site of the altar in the Beis HaMikdash, is the site where Adam HaRishon, Adam, gave his korban. It's the site, according to the Masorah, where Noach gave his sacrifice. It's the site where Cain and Hevel gave their sacrifice. The idea of Pesach is separation. Goy Mikerev Goy, who was the separation of the Jewish people. Avram Parshas Lech Lecha is the process of separation. So Avram separates himself. And the separation was necessary as a prerequisite for the Geirus, for the conversion. But we have to understand, just because we separate ourselves doesn't mean that we don't care. We have to understand that we're part of the world as well. If there is anything that we can learn from the situation, the COVID situation that we're dealing with today, the things that affect the rest of the world affect us as well. COVID might have started in China, but it reached Lakewood, it reached Borough Park, it reached Muncie, it reached the yeshiva world. Every day we hear of people dying and passing away. Rosh Yeshivas, Gdolei Yisrael. To a certain degree, perhaps less people would have died if we didn't just reject what the medical community said. But we had to show that we were different. I've heard nonsense where Rosh Yeshivas and big Talmidei Chachamim and fine people, but nevertheless, everybody could say nonsense, could get up in front of an audience and say all the tests that show that smoking cigarettes is detrimental to health, has no application to Jews. They only demonstrated it with non-Jews. Where does such idiocy come from? Where does such nonsense come from? Especially from Talmidei Chachamim. It comes from this stupidity. It's not individual stupidity, it's communal stupidity. That we have nothing to do with the rest of the world. We can close ourselves off from the rest of the world. Not to talk about the social problems that are now facing and always faced our community. You think drugs is not a Jewish problem? course it's a Jewish problem, because we're part of the world community also. And if there's crime outside, there can be crime inside also. We are influenced. Our community's influenced. You can do what you want. We know tons of young people are leaving the most isolated of the Jewish communities in upstate New York. There's no TV, there's no radio, but there is influence. And when doctors say take shots, oh, they find pictures of 10 doctors who said not to take a shot. Why don't they get the pictures of all the doctors who said to take a shot? Who have names like in a telephone book. But they have to show, no, we're not part of the community. The doctors that we pick, the doctors that say what we want them to say, even though they're considered crazy by the professional world. So we have to separate ourselves. There's no room for interfaith, ritualistic activity. We don't have to discuss our religion with them, and we're not interested in their religion. Everybody can have their own religion. I remember when I graduated college, the speaker was Uthant, Secretary General of the UN. He said, let Jews be better Jews, let Muslims be better Muslims, let Christians be better Christians. Let us be better Jews. We're not interested in interfaith activity. We're interested in the cities. We're interested there shouldn't be crime. We're interested there shouldn't be disease. We're interested in education. We have to understand education for the rest of the world is education for us also. There are stupid people who believe that all the things that are morally incorrect in the world is no problem for us. The truth is, it would be a problem for us no matter what. The influence is there. But what do you think? If we're going to take aid from the government for our institutions, ultimately we're going to have to bring in these courses that advocate things that the Torah considered totally moral. So we are part of the world, one way or another. Of course, we want to be separate as much as we can, but not to the degree that it cuts us off from the rest of the world. And so the Makom HaMizbeach, there was a certain identification with the nations of the world, with universalism. So even after we go through Geirus, so the Pesach represents separation. But nevertheless, who is the symbol of separation? Avram. And who's the symbol of Gemilas Chasadim, of helping every human being out? Avram. We have to somehow take these two opposite approaches and put them together. Heve Avram. We have to be like Avram. And so Pesach, we have the three Mizbechos that were identified only with Avram. Now, so the Torah after the Geirus of Avram, after Avram becomes a Jew, the Torah tells us about the midos of Avram, Rachmanim, Baishanim, Kamle Chasadim, being merciful and all that. But not just with Jews, not just with the base Avram, with the house of Avram, but for non-Jews as well. We have to show mercy, We have to show dedication. We have to show devotion. But we have to understand one thing. We have to believe in universalism. There was no person, I mentioned the hesped I gave Sukkot to my father. My father was concerned about every human being. I mentioned the story when he was younger. When I was younger, my father, when I went in the subways in New York, would tell me to stay by the wall. It was almost like an obsession. And I wondered, why is it that way? But then I found out, because when he was a young person, a certain anti-Semitic lady pushed him on the tracks of the subway. And my father got up out of the subway, out of the tracks of the subway, and climbed up. But then he helped, but that lady also fell on the tracks. My father helped her get off the tracks also. And at that time, there was a Catholic priest. And the Catholic priest went over to my father and he said to my father, "What's your name?" My father said, "Aaron Soloveichik." The Catholic priest said to my father, "Bless me. I never saw a person as holy as you." We make ourselves separate doesn't mean that we can't be concerned about the lives of others. We can, we should, and we must. And we have to help out the poor, whether it's the poor Jews or the poor non-Jews, we have to help them out. So the Torah tells us, after Avram became a Jew, completed his Jewishness with the Bris Milah, his devotion to all of mankind was still there, even to people that were idol worshippers. Now, it's very interesting that now, so what we have to understand, and the truth is, the Rambam in Perek Yud of Hilchos Melachim, he talks there about the mitzvah of Ger Toshav, but he says, even in regard to Akum, the Chacham, there is a halacha of showing kindness to them because of Darkei Shalom. In order there should be peace between mankind, between us and them. But then when he says, Harei Nemar Tov Hashem Lakol V'Rachamav Al Kol Masav, which is a pasuk in Tehillim, and then he says, V'Nemar Dracheha Darkei Noam B'Chol Nesiveha Shalom, which is in Mishlei. And the Shiurei Carbon on the Yerushalmi in Gittin asks the question, why did he have to mention the first pasuk? We're talking about Darkei Shalom, about showing peace, trying to make peace between people. That's why we have to show kindness. But why did he have to say, Tov Hashem Lakol V'Rachamav Al Kol Masav, that God has mercy on everybody? Why wasn't the Shalom good enough? And he says there are many, many situations, and I would be willing to say, certainly at the perspective of today, my father discussed all the Gemaras that seem to contradict this. So that we have an obligation to take care of the needs of the non-Jews for a double reason. One, because of peace, and one, because of Rachmanis, to show mercy. Yes, there are certain people that we don't have to show mercy to, but that's the minority, a very small minority. Obviously, you don't have to save the life of a Nazi who is out to kill you. And there are others as well, but so because of that, there's two reasons. One is Rachmanis, and the other is Shalom. What's the mitzvah? V'halachta b'drachav. You have to follow in the path of God. God is Rachamav al Kol Masav. He shows Rachamim, he shows mercy to all of creation. With few exceptions, we also have to show mercy to all creation. And at the same time, we have to promote peace between different people. So there is Darkei Shalom as well. But what we have to understand is, why is it that the traits are mentioned after the mitzvah Bris Milah? After Abraham went through Bris Milah, one is to show that that's part of being Jewish, but it's more than that. Our universalism, there was no person I mentioned that I knew that was as concerned about human beings. Rav Mordechai Gifted, the Rosh Hashiva said about my father, Rav Aaron Soloveichik is the only gadol who not only is concerned about the people in Biafra, but he even knows that there are people in Biafra. Why did he say, why was my father concerned? Because by my father, his universalism emanated from his Judaism. The problem today is that those that are concerned about universalism, their Judaism emanates from their universalism. And because of this, they sometimes give support to the enemies of the Jewish people, murderers, people who kill babies. You find today Jews that don't want to allow Jewish people to defend themselves. They oppose the Iron Dome, defensive weapon. Then when they have to give an answer, unless you'll give aid, extra aid to the people in Gaza to make more bombs. When universalism emanates from Judaism, there is concern for the world. It's not lack of concern for the world. But when Judaism emanates from the universalism, at the end, Jews themselves could become some of the biggest Sonei Yisrael that there are. That's the lesson from Avram. Avram was as universalistic of a person as there was. But the Torah tells us about his midos after he went through Gerus, after through his conversion, after his Jewishness was completed, that we should know that these midos, that by Avram, the midos, he might have had the midos before, but ultimately, once he became Jewish, his devotion and dedication to all people emanated from his commitment to God, from his commitment to the Jewish people, to all future generations of the Jewish people. His universalism emanated from his Judaism, and that's what we have to do today. We have to be concerned about the rest of the world. We can't live in a fake world of stupidity, but at the same time, we can't become our own worst enemies. Our universalism has to emanate from our Judaism, not our Judaism from our universalism. Okay.
Thank you. If anyone has questions, please put it in the chat. One question is, and I'm going to reword it from the way person said it. Why didn't Avram try to convince Lot not to go to Sodom? Obviously, Lot had free will, but should have Avram's care and concern about others, should that have required him to try to convince Lot not to go to Sodom?
Well, it's, first of all, I don't know at that point whether the people were at that, first of all, initially he didn't go to Sodom itself, he went outside Sodom. But Avram knew, first of all, we don't know that he didn't try to convince him. We don't know. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, Avram knew that once Lot leaves him, he wouldn't listen to him anyway. He'll do what he wants.
Okay, again, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Okay, it does not look like there's any questions. Should we reread your father's article about fellowship and brotherhood?
That's you can reread it. I think, and those who can, the Sefer and Hilchos Havelus, O Joseph Yisrael B'nai Chai, Siman Gimel. That's a special chapter. It's worthwhile making a seder in it.
Okay. So that one, for people know, that's in Hebrew. But,
that's in Hebrew, and
you
you have to have some acquaintance with learning in order to go through it. It's and really you would need someone, depending who the person is, who is acquainted with learning.
your father had an article of Jew and not Jew, and
Jew
and
non-Jew,
and also civil rights, and the dignity of man.
And the dignity of man, that's right.
And at least one of those is also on yutorah.org. I'll try to put the link on the YouTube if I could find.
Which one is that?
It's about the fellowship versus brotherhood.
Oh,
one.
yeah. So that's the Jew and non-Jew. Yeah. Okay. That's what it is. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any